In the vast corpus of Hellenic geography, where the known world dissolves into the ink of the uncharted, there exists a specific coordinate that functions less as a landmass and more as a scar upon the map. This is Aeaea, the island at the edge of the world, a place that the poet Homer anchors firmly in the text of the Odyssey, Book 10, lines 135 through 150, not merely as a setting for a monster, but as a necessary boundary marker for the civilization of man. To the ancient navigator, the Aegean Sea was a highway of reasonable risks, but beyond the pillars of Heracles, the maritime routes curved into the terrifying unknown. Here, in this isolation, the island sits, a physical manifestation of the limit of human understanding. It is a domain of dense forests and meadows that exists in a perpetual, unsettling twilight, separated from the laws that govern the cities of Greece by leagues of treacherous water. The island's topography is documented with the precision of a surveyor in the epic verses, describing terrain that is simultaneously inviting and hostile to human industry. Upon the central plateau, a structure rises from the wild vegetation, a house built of hewn stone, polished to a mirror sheen that reflects the unnatural light of this western vertex. It is not a ruin nor a cave, but a completed structure, implying a permanent resident of immense power who does not fear the elements. The text details the perimeter, noting the surrounding terrain is patrolled by wild beasts that do not hunt, wolves and mountain lions, creatures that move with a fluidity that denies their bestial nature. These animals are the first indication that the laws of nature have been suspended at this coordinate. They are not emaciated scavengers, but sleek, docile sentinels that fawn over the intruder, their eyes retaining an intelligence that belongs to a human soul. This specific detail, preserved on the fragile papyrus scrolls of the Homeric tradition, transforms the island from a simple geographic location into a biological anomaly. Archaeological evidence, particularly the study of archaic Greek settlement patterns, confirms that the Greeks viewed the periphery of their world as a place where the civilizing influence of the polis gave way to the raw chaos of the wild. Aeaea is the ultimate expression of this periphery. It is a liminal space, a threshold where the rules of the city, the laws of Zeus, and the order of the family unit dissolve. The men who arrive here are sailors from Ithaca, representatives of the Western Greek tradition, bringing with them the customs of the agora and the ship. They arrive at a beach that offers no safe harbor, forcing them to anchor their vessels in the open water and swim to shore, a transition that strips them of their technology and their status. This physical struggle to reach the land mirrors the metaphysical struggle they are about to face. They are not entering a port of trade, they are entering a jurisdiction where their humanity is a liability. The function of the island as a gatekeeper is essential to understanding the necessity of its mistress. In Theogony, a composition attributed to Hesiod dating to the 8th century BCE, the lineage of the island's ruler is established, placing her in a dynasty of titans and monsters that predates the Olympian order. This genealogical record identifies the resident not as a mere witch, but as a figure of primordial authority, a being born of the sun who sees all things. The island itself acts as an extension of her will, a contained ecosystem designed to filter the worthy from the unworthy. When the crew of Odysseus steps onto the sands, they are trespassing into a domain that does not recognize the laws of men. The silence of the forest, broken only by the terrifyingly gentle roar of the beasts, signals that this is a place where nature has been subjugated to a singular will. As the narrative of the Odyssey unfolds, the structural design of the island serves to trap the intruder in a web of psychological disorientation. The men, led by a lieutenant named Polites, hear a voice singing within the stone hall, a sound that carries across the meadow. Described in line 222 as a clear voice, weaving a fabric of sound that entices the weary sailors. This song is not a lure of the siren, but a signal of domestic industry. It implies that this wild edge of the world contains a center of civilization, a hearth and a hostess. The dichotomy is sharp and deliberate. The perimeter is wild, filled with beasts, yet the center is domestic, filled with song and the loom. This juxtaposition forces the sailor to let down his guard, expecting the hospitality that is a sacred law in the Greek world. They approach the polished stone hall expecting the rites of Xenos, the guest friendship that protects the traveler. Instead, they find a distortion of the domestic sphere. The location of Aeaea, positioned at the edge of the world, ensures that only the most lost and desperate travelers stumble upon its shores. It is a place that cannot be found by design, only by disaster. The currents that lead here are the ones that sweep the navigator away from the safety of the return route, the nostos. Thus, the island acts as a net, catching those who have failed to navigate the perils of the earlier voyage. Once caught within this perimeter, the sailor is subjected to a trial that tests the very essence of his identity. The beasts that patrol the grounds are the predecessors of the men who will soon enter the hall, living proof of the fate that awaits those who cannot assert their dominance over this environment. The island preserves the transgression of previous travelers, keeping them as living statues in the garden, a menagerie of the failed. This geographical isolation is not a punishment, but a strategic necessity for the being who resides there. To maintain the boundary between the world of men and the world of myth, the guardian must be isolated. The civilization of Greece, with its iron, its writing, and its laws, expands outward, threatening to absorb the mystery of the world. Aeaea stands as a fortress against this expansion, a pocket of the old world where the Olympian order holds no sway. The walls of the hall are not built to keep the world out, but to keep the magical reverberations of the Titans contained within, preventing the chaotic energy from spilling back into the Mediterranean. The mistress of this domain sits at the center of this containment field, weaving the fabric of the island's reality on her loom, a physical object that mirrors the geography of her home. The arrival of Odysseus and his crew represents the collision of two incompatible systems. The men see an island, a resource, a potential site for rest and resupply. The island, however, sees the men as raw material. The text in Book 10 describes the men entering the hall and sitting in silence, observing the structure of the room, noting the lack of male authority, and misunderstanding the nature of their host. They view the island through the lens of their own hierarchy, assuming that because they are Greek men, they are the apex predators of any environment. They fail to recognize that by stepping onto the shores of Aeaea, they have entered a liminal state where their terrestrial power is nullified. The stone walls of the house, described with such architectural solidity, are the borders of a state of being that consumes the unprepared. The eventual transformation of the men is not an act of random malice, but the primary function of the island itself. The geography demands it. A gate must have a mechanism to repel the unauthorized. In this edge world, the only currency is identity. The loss of shape, the reduction of the human form to that of a pig, is the island's immune response to the intrusion of the mundane. It strips away the pretense of civilization that the sailors carry, revealing them as gluttons and usurpers, beings who seek only to consume and conquer. The island of Aeaea, isolated by the dark waters of the west, holds up a mirror to the soul of the visitor, and for the crew of Odysseus that reflection is bestial. Thus, the location is the architect of the event. Had Circe resided in the center of the Greek world, her power would have been checked by the temples of the gods, the armies of kings, and the statutes of the city. Placed at the edge, she is absolute. The physical distance from the centers of power grants her the autonomy to act as the gatekeeper of the soul. The men do not turn into swine because they are victims of a witch. They turn into swine because they have walked into a foundry of identity at the end of the world, unprepared to forge a new self. The island stands as a testament to the fragility of the human condition when removed from the protection of the polis, a lonely monolith of stone and magic where the map ends and the judgment begins. Within the bloodline of the immortals, lineage is not merely a matter of pedigree, but a source of raw elemental function, a transmission of power that flows through the veins like the currents of the sea. The figure who stands at the center of the Aeaean mystery is introduced in the Theogony of Hesiod, specifically in lines 957 through 962, not as a sorceress of obscure origin, but as a scion of the heavens themselves. She is the daughter of Helios Hyperion, the Titan who drives the burning chariot across the sky, a being whose very essence is the surveillance of the earth. This paternal connection anchors the mistress of the island in a dynasty that predates the structured, patriarchal order of Mount Olympus. linking her to a primordial force that views the world with a terrible, all-seeing clarity. The sun does not judge, it merely exposes, and in this exposure, it grants its daughter a perspective that is entirely alien to the mortal men who wash up on her shores. The physical evidence of this lineage is catalogued in the Homeric hymn to Helios, a fragment of archaic poetry that describes the residence of the sun as a palace of columned gold, situated in the east, far removed from the stone hall of Aeaea. Yet the inheritance travels with the daughter. When Odysseus encounters her in the Odyssey, Book 10, line 138, the text attributes to her a richly embroidered dress that shines with a brilliance that mimics the dawn, a tangible marker of her solar patrimony. This garment is not simply an aesthetic choice, it is a uniform of authority. While the Olympian gods, such as Zeus and Poseidon, are often depicted through their thunderbolts or tridents, the power of Helios is a constant, pervasive illumination. His daughter carries this luminosity in her very presence, a radiance that pierces the shadows of her island forest, signaling that she is a power of the old world, untempered by the new diplomatic compromises of the Olympian Council. To understand the weight of this heritage, one must examine the stratigraphy of divine rule through the lens of Hesiod's genealogical records. Helios is a Titan, a member of the generation that preceded the reign of Zeus, born of Hyperion and Aeaea. This places Circe outside the direct jurisdiction of the Olympian hierarchy in a way that mere nymphs or minor goddesses are not. The Titans represent the raw, chaotic forces of nature, the earth, the sky, the sun, the memory of time forces that were violently subjugated by the more civilized and politicized Olympians. The excavation of the altar at Corinth, dedicated to Helios, reveals a site of deep antiquity, predating the classical temples of Apollo or Athena, suggesting that the worship of the sun was a foundational stratum of Greek religion. Circe, as a daughter of the stratum, possesses an authority that is archaic and autochthonous. She does not derive her power from a position granted by Zeus. She possesses it as an intrinsic right of her blood. The maternal line serves to further complicate this inheritance, infusing the solar fire with a darker, more fluid potency. Her mother is Perse and Oceanid, a daughter of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, beings who represent the freshwater sources in the encircling river of the world. This union of the sun and the ocean produces a specific alchemy in their offspring. In the Bibliotheca, a compendium of Greek mythology attributed to Apollodorus, the entry for Book 1, Chapter 9, Section 1, lists the children of Helios and Perse as a terrifying triad, Aeaea, Pasiphae, and Circe. Aeaea becomes the tyrant king of Colchis, the guardian of the Golden Fleece. Pasiphae becomes the queen of Crete, the mother of the Minotaur, and Circe takes her place on the island at the edge of the world. This sibling set establishes a pattern of sovereignty and monstrosity. They are not servants of the status quo, they are weavers of chaos and challenge, ruling over kingdoms that sit on the fringes of the civilized Greek world. The specific nature of the solar power in Circe's hands is the ability to reveal truth through transformation. Helios is the all-seeing, a witness to every oath, every transgression, and every hidden deed. When his daughter turns men into animals, she is engaging in a grotesque parody of this paternal attribute. She sees the true nature of the man, the glutton, the coward, the aggressor, and strips away the civilized veneer to expose the beast beneath. The Odyssey provides a material anchor for this power in the form of the golden wand, or rod, mentioned in Book 10, line 238, and again in line 317. The staff is a symbol of her office, but unlike the caduceus of Hermes, which facilitates trade and communication, the rod of Circe enforces a singular, irreversible judgment. It is an instrument of a Titan's justice, swift, absolute, and devoid of the nuance or mercy that characterizes the later courts of Olympus. This Titan bloodline also explains the fierce independence that defines her character and her island. She resides far from the pantheon, needing neither their approval nor their company. In the Homeric hymn to Apollo, the struggle for territory and influence among the gods is a central theme, yet Circe is absent from these disputes. Her isolation is a result of her sovereignty. She is a remnant of the golden age of the Titans, a sovereign entity in a world that has shifted toward the patriarchal oligarchy of Zeus. The sailors who arrive on her island are representatives of this new order, men of the palace, subjects of Odysseus, a king whose patron is Athena, the goddess of the city. The conflict is not merely personal, it is a collision of epics. The primal power of the sun meets the political power of the city. The visual culture of the archaic period supports this distinction. Pottery fragments from the 6th century BCE, specifically the Attic black figure vases held in the British Museum, often depict Helios rising from the sea in a quadriga, a 4-horse chariot, his head surrounded by a solar disk. Circe is frequently depicted on similar vessels, such as the Circe vase attributed to the Brigos painter, holding her wand over men whose forms are shifting. The artistic convention consistently portrays her with a profile that mirrors the severe, unsmiling visages of the Titans, distinct from the softer, more idealized features of the Olympian goddesses like Aphrodite or Hera. She shares the solar crown's implication of terror. She is a figure of awe, not affection. The narrative of the Argonautica, composed by Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century BCE, further solidifies this role of the sorceress as a figure of ancient authority. In Book 4, lines 5559 through 591, Circe purifies Jason and Medea, her niece, of the murder of Medea's brother. This act of purification, a religious function, demonstrates that her power extends beyond transformation to the cleansing of sin, a prerogative usually reserved for the highest deities. She is a priestess of her own authority, capable of adjudicating the metaphysical pollution of spilt kindred blood. Here, the daughter of the sun acts as a judge of the dead and the living, a liminal figure standing between states of being, much as her father stands between the night and the day. The blood of Helios provides a physiological basis for her magic that is absent in the folklore of later witchcraft. She does not invoke spirits or petition higher powers. She acts. The potions she brews, the pharmaca that she pours into the wine of the sailors, are extensions of her own essence. The light of the sun is a solvent. It breaks down the shadows and reveals the forms hidden within the darkness. In the same manner, her potions dissolve the human shape, allowing the internal animal to emerge and solidify. The golden cup from which she offers the drink, described in the text, is an extension of the solar chariot, a vessel that contains a blinding, transformative fire. Through the lens of this genealogy, the actions on the island are recast not as villainy, but as the prerogative of a superior species. The men who intrude upon her hall are not merely unlucky travelers, they are insurgents against the order of the Titans, carrying the hubris of the Olympian-subsidized humanity. Circe, the daughter of the sun with the golden wand and the burning blood, acts as the guardian of a reality that the Greeks have chosen to forget. She stands as a monument to the raw, unfiltered power of nature, a power that recognizes no borders and acknowledges no king, maintaining her dominion over the edge of the world with the authority of the first light. The name of a divinity in the ancient world was never a mere label of convenience, but rather a sonic artifact, a key crafted from sound that unlocked the fundamental nature of the being it designated. In the case of the mistress of Aeaea, the name inscribed upon the dried clay of linear B tablets found in the palace of Knossos, though debated by linguists, points toward a root that conjures the image of the hunt. The Greeks knew her as Circe, a word that vibrates with the double meaning of the predator and the trap. To speak her name was to invoke the concept of the circle, not as a geometric ideal of perfection, but as a closed loop of entrapment from which there is no egress, a linguistic prison that foretold the fate of every man who stepped into her hall. The primary linguistic engine for this interpretation rests within the pages of the Liddell and Scott Greek-English lexicon, the definitive record of the ancient tongue, where the entry for Kirkos is defined with cold precision as a kind of hawk or falcon. This term, Kirkos, specifically denotes a bird that does not strike from a straight line, but rather patrols the skies in wide looping arcs, scanning the earth for the movement of prey. The connection is not an etymological coincidence. It is a functional description of the goddess herself. Just as the hawk circles the field, creating an invisible perimeter of death for the rodent below, the goddess circles the minds of men, creating a perimeter of delusion. Ancient scholia, those marginal notes scribbled by Byzantine scholars on the papyrus scrolls of the Odyssey, explicitly draw this parallel, noting that she is called Circe because she circles the minds of her victims, twisting their perceptions until they are lost within the gyre of her will. This avian association transforms the stone hall of Aeaea into a nest of a different sort, a place where the predator does not consume the flesh, but the identity. A striking example of this nomenclature in action can be found on a red figure, Attic vase dated to 480 BCE, currently residing in the British Museum, where the goddess is depicted not with the soft features of a courtesan, but with a sharp, aquiline nose and eyes painted with a fierce, predatory intensity. The artist has captured the Kirkos in her profile. She is the hawk that circles the weary traveler, waiting for the moment when vigilance fades and the mind opens to the sky of her suggestion. The men who drink her wine are not merely poisoned. They are spotted from above, isolated from the herd of their companions, and stooped upon by a will that is faster and sharper than their own. The second strand of this etymological rope, the concept of the circle or ring, binds the prey once it has been identified. In the archaic Greek mind, the circle was often a symbol of inevitability, a shape that has no beginning and no end, and thus no exit. The Orphic gold tablets, those thin strips of gold foil buried with the initiates of mystery cults in Thurii and Crete, speak of cycles of rebirth and the wheel of necessity, a concept that mirrors the name of Circe. When she administers her potions, she is not simply changing the shape of a man, she is placing him inside a circle of instinct. The pig, by its very nature, is a creature of the cycle of gluttony and sleep, a repetitive loop of desire and satisfaction that allows for no higher thought. By turning the men into swine, she is literally circling them, closing the loop of their base desires so that they cannot escape back into the world of linear human progress. The scholia on the Odyssey further elaborate on this mechanism by referencing a specific type of trap used in ancient hunting, the kyklos, a ring of nets or a palisade used to enclose game within a forest. The goddess operates as this living net. Her voice, described in Book 10 as she sings while working at her loom, is the sonic equivalent of the hunter's net. The weaving of the looms serves as a physical parallel to the weaving of the circle. The thread spirals inward, and with each pass of the shuttle, the pattern becomes tighter, more constricted. The loom weights found at archaeological sites like Pylos, heavy terracotta discs that pull the warp threads taut, serve as a reminder that this weaving was a labor of tension and weight. The song she sings is the same song the hawk sings on the wind, a hypnotic vibration that lulls the prey into a state of false security before the talons close. This circular entrapment extends to the psychological state of the men who encounter her. They arrive with a goal, a trajectory that points homeward, a straight line from Troy to Ithaca. The intervention of Circe is a bending of that line into a curve. She disrupts the linear narrative of their lives and forces them into a stasis, a holding pattern where time itself ceases to have meaning. The men transformed into pigs do not age, nor do they die. They exist in a perpetual present, a circle of being that feeds only upon itself. This is the horror of the name. She is the end circler, the one who takes the linear energy of the hero and dissolves it into the cyclic futility of the beast. The specific word used in the Odyssey for her magic, pharmaca, is often translated as drugs, but in the context of her name, it functions as the chemical agent of the circle. A liquid boundary that, once crossed, denies the drinker the ability to move forward. There is a deeper, more primal layer to this nomenclature that connects the goddess to the pre-Olympian chanting powers. Those earth goddesses whose dominion was the cycle of the seasons and the rotation of the stars. The circular dance of the heavens, the path of the sun driven by her father Helios, is the ultimate expression of the Circe. She is the inheritor of this cosmic rotation. While her father drives the chariot in a circle across the sky, she enforces a similar rotation on the ground, ensuring that those who violate the sanctity of her domain are stripped of their chaotic, forward-moving ambition and forced into the rhythmic cyclical obedience of nature. The very ground of her island, surrounded by the endless circling of the ocean waves, mirrors the meaning of her name, creating a fractal of entrapment where the water circles the land, the wall circles the house, the goddess circles the mind, and the pig circles the trough. The name, therefore, acts as the first and most potent weapon in her arsenal, a word that predates the Olympian order and speaks to a time when nature was a closed system of predator and prey. It is a warning that went unheeded by the crew of Odysseus, a warning inscribed in the very syllables of her identity. They heard a woman's name, a soft sound, but they should have heard the screech of the hawk and the snap of the closing ring. In the lexicon of antiquity, to speak the name of the goddess was to acknowledge her function as the one who turns, the one who winds the thread of fate until it breaks the spine of the linear traveler. The name Circe stands as a monolith of linguistic truth, declaring that within the perimeter of her island the only direction is down and the only shape is the circle. The auditory signal that guides the weary sailors through the dense forests of Aeaea is not the roar of a monster, but the rhythmic clatter of the loom, a sound of domestic industry that belies the savage nature of the island's guardian. In Book 10, lines 221 through 24 of the Odyssey, the text places the goddess upon a polished throne, her hands moving a great warp weighted with golden threads, singing in a clear voice that carries over the treetops. This instrument, the histos, serves as the physical anchor of her domestic authority, a symbol of order and civilization typically associated with the virtuous queens of the mainland. The loom weights, heavy terracotta or lead discs that tension the vertical threads, have been recovered in vast numbers from sites like the Palace of Nestor in Pylos, catalog number P65-162, tangible evidence of the labor that defined the noblewoman's domain. The presence of this specific tool in the hall of Circe constructs a paradox that the men fail to perceive. For while they expect to find a sorceress wreathed in flame, they instead find a weaver crafting a fabric that mimics the very structure of fate itself. The inversion of the natural order becomes immediately apparent upon crossing the threshold of the forest, where the visitor encounters beasts that defy their own biology. The text describes wolves and mountain lions, creatures of predatory instinct, lying docile and fawning around the knees of the goddess like loyal hounds. These are not starved scavengers, but beasts of strength and majesty, their eyes holding a strange, suppressed intelligence. This specific interaction identifies Circe as the Potnia Theron, the mistress of animals, an archetype documented on the famous gold signet ring from the Aesopotis cemetery in Knossos, dated to the Minoan period. On this seal, the goddess stands triumphant, flanked by lions that move with a ceremonial grace, submissive to her superior power. The lions of Aeaea are not merely pets. They are conquered nature, raw instinct that has been bent to the will of a higher intelligence. Stripped of their savagery by the mere proximity of her presence, the juxtaposition of the domestic loom and the savage lions creates a terrifying mirror for the men who arrive at her door. The goddess sits as the ultimate civilizing force, a being capable of taking the raw chaos of the wild and forcing it into a state of gentle obedience. The lions who should be rending flesh instead wag their tails and whimper, demonstrating that their primal nature has been overwritten by the discipline of the goddess. When the sailors, led by the eager Polites, approach the stone hall, they see this tableau of impossible peace and misinterpret it as safety. They believe they are entering a standard household where the rules of hospitality apply, failing to recognize that the civilizing power they witness is an indiscriminate force. The goddess does not distinguish between the wild beast of the forest and the wild beast of the ship. Both are subject to her ability to impose form upon chaos. The transformation that follows acts as a direct counterpoint to the scene of the loom. The men who represent the pinnacle of Greek civilization, the agents of the sacking of Troy, devolve into grunting swine, rolling in mud and eating acorns. This metamorphosis is not a random curse, but a calculated judgment rendered upon their character. The loom, which creates order by interlacing threads into a cohesive pattern, reveals the truth of the men's souls. They are found to be lacking the internal structure that makes them human. While the lions were wild beasts that were forced into civility, the men are civilized beings who are revealed to be beasts. The potion she administers, the pharmaca, acts as a solvent that washes away the veneer of culture, leaving only the base animal underneath. The specific wooden cup from which she serves the wine, mentioned in line 234, becomes the vessel of truth, stripping away the lies of their station. Archaeological evidence from the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia in Sparta provides a grim parallel to this function. Excavations at the site uncovered numerous lead figurines depicting various animals, offerings made to a goddess who controlled the boundaries between the human and the bestial. The goddess of Aeaea functions within this same sphere of influence. She controls the fluidity of identity. By turning the men into pigs, she is not degrading them, but rather aligning their physical form with their internal reality, a process far more honest than the polite deceptions of the mortal world. The pig was a creature of filth and gluttony in the Greek mindset, an animal that consumed without restraint, mirroring the behavior of the sailors who sought to plunder her stores without courtesy. The loom further serves as a metaphor for the entrapment that defines her island. Just as the weaver traps the weft thread between the warp, pulling it tight to create a solid fabric, the goddess traps the men within their new forms. The Odyssey describes the fabric she weaves as fine, woven, and divine, a physical manifestation of the intricate snares she sets for the mind. The men are caught in a web where their intellect is the fly and her magic is the silk. The structural integrity of the hall, with its polished stone and secure doors, reinforces this sense of inescapable design. They enter freely expecting to be guests, but they find themselves items in the collection, fixed in place by a will that operates on a level of existence they cannot comprehend. The inversion of the civilized and the savage is the central horror and truth of the Aeaean episode. The lions act with the dignity of nobles, standing guard and showing restraint, while the Greeks act with the greed of pigs, rooting in the dirt for food. The goddess, through her power, has inverted the hierarchy of nature. She demonstrates that civilization is not a birthright of the human species, but a condition of the spirit that must be maintained. Those who fail to uphold the internal laws of hospitality, respect, and restraint are stripped of their external shape and reduced to their true spiritual equivalent. The loom continues to clack, the shuttle flying back and forth, indifferent to the squeals of the new arrivals, a mechanical heartbeat in a house where nature has been turned inside out. This dominion over the boundary of the beast establishes Circe not as a villain, but as an arbiter of natural law. She acts as the filter, separating the noble from the base. The lions, though born of the wild, have been elevated by her presence to the status of guardians. The men, born of cities, have been lowered by their own actions to the status of livestock. The archaeological record of the Lady of the Beasts figurines, such as the ivory statuette from the Minoan site of Policastro, shows a goddess with arms outstretched, controlling two birds or cats, a posture of dominance that predates the patriarchal narratives of the Olympians. Circe stands in this ancient lineage, holding the leash of nature, indifferent to the claims of kings. The final image of the hall is one of absolute order, a room where the savage lies at rest and the civilized man is caged in a body of filth. The goddess sings, her voice clear and sweet, weaving a fabric that covers the world in a pattern of her own design. The men lie in the mud outside, their human minds trapped within the skull of a swine, aware of their fall, but unable to speak, while the wolves and lions sleep peacefully on the rugs of the great hall. The loom stands as a testament to the power that forces chaos into shape, and the lions stand as proof that the wild can be tamed, leaving the pigs to grunt in the filth of their own making. The mechanism by which the mistress of Aeaea enacts her will is not a phenomenon of impossible sorcery, but a rigorous application of an ancient science known to the Greeks as pharmaca. In the lexicon of the archaic world, the word pharmakon carried a trifold meaning that modern tongues have severed. It signified a cure, a poison, and an enchantment. When the Odyssey, Book 10, line 235, describes Circe mixing a compound into the wine of the sailors, it employs this specific terminology. stating that she cast the pharmaca into the mixture to strip them of their memory. This action, executed with the precision of a chemist, grounds her power not in the whims of the divine, but in the tangible properties of the earth. The bronze mortar and pestle, a standard accoutrement of the ancient physician, would have been the first instrument a visitor saw upon entering her hall, a tool of civilization that she wielded with a proficiency that predates the ethical distinctions of modern medicine. To understand the nature of the transformation that befell the crew of Odysseus, one must examine the botanical inventory of the Mediterranean region, specifically catalogued in the 5 volumes of De Materia Medica by Pedanius Dioscorides, a physician of the 1st century CE. This pharmacological compendium, a successor to the lost texts of the Bronze Age, lists thousands of plants, many of which possess the capacity to alter the human mind and body in ways that mimic the work of the gods. Among these, the Datura stramonium, known as the thorn apple, or the Mandragora officinarum, the mandrake, stand as prime candidates for the agents of metamorphosis. These plants contain potent alkaloids such as scopolamine and hyoscyamine, compounds that induce profound hallucinations, loss of memory, and a dissociation from the self. The physical effects of ingesting a tincture derived from the roots of the mandrake include a flushing of the skin, a thickening of the tongue, and a descent into a primal instinctual state, symptoms that align perfectly with the textual description of the men losing their human form. The text of the Odyssey specifies that the goddess served her guests Pramnian wine, a dark, strong vintage often associated with the island of Aeaea, into which she grated the cheese of goats and added barley meal. This mixture, a form of kykeon, was a traditional beverage used in religious rituals, most notably the Eleusinian Mysteries, where it served as a vessel for psychoactive experiences. By blending the pharmaca into this thick, nourishing slurry, she masked the bitterness of the alkaloids and ensured the rapid absorption of the toxins into the bloodstreams of the weary men. The wooden mixing bowl, described as being fitted with handles, serves as the physical anchor for this biochemical event, a mundane object transformed into a trap by the knowledge of the herbalist. The sailors consumed the draught as guests, expecting nourishment, but they received a chemical sentence that dismantled their cognitive faculties. The visible transformation of the men into swine is best interpreted through the lens of a massive, collective hallucination induced by the pharmaca. The Odyssey describes the physical striking of the men with her wand, the rhabdos, an act that often obscures the chemical cause with a theatrical effect. However, the rhabdos may have served as a focal point, a psychological trigger that cemented the suggestion implanted by the drugs. In the realm of ancient psychiatry, the administration of the placebo or a hypnotic suggestion was often paired with a physical instrument to direct the patient's mind. The men, their brains flooded with deliriant toxins, perceived their own reflection in the polished stone walls of the hall, or perhaps in the eyes of their companions as that of beasts. Their inability to speak, a side effect of the paralysis caused by the alkaloids, reinforced the belief that they had lost their voices. They became pigs, not because their flesh literally reformed into bristles and trotters, but because the pharmaca severed the connection between their consciousness and their humanity, leaving them to wander the sty of their own distorted perception. This interpretation repositions the figure of Circe from a supernatural freak to a master herbalist, a guardian of a potent and dangerous lore. The island of Aeaea functioned as a laboratory where the raw, chaotic forces of nature were distilled into precise instruments of change. The storage vessels found in the ruins of Mycenaean palaces, such as the large stirrup jars used for oils and unguents, offer a parallel to the jars that would have lined the walls of her house, containing the dried roots, the seeds, and the resins of her trade. Each jar held the potential for healing or for destruction, a duality that the Greeks understood intimately. The knowledge required to identify, harvest, and process these plants was a specialized skill, one that was often the province of women and was passed down through generations. This expertise was a form of power that rivaled the sword, for it allowed the wielder to bypass the physical defenses of the warrior and strike directly at the mind. The use of pharmaca also serves to explain the specific choice of the pig as the vessel of transformation. In the ancient world, the pig was an animal associated with the earth, with fertility and with a lack of inhibition. The toxins derived from the solanaceous plants tend to strip away the higher functions of the frontal cortex, leaving the primitive brainstem in control. The result is a creature driven by hunger, fear, and aggression, the very traits the Greeks attributed to the swine. The men, stripped of their societal conditioning and their tactical minds, reverted to a state that the observer would recognize as bestial. The chemical agent acted as a truth serum, dissolving the veneer of discipline that the soldiers had maintained during the long voyage from Troy, revealing the raw, hungry animal beneath the armor. The wand itself, often dismissed as a prop of magic, finds a functional parallel in the botanical tools of antiquity. Dioscorides describes the use of sticks to extract roots or to stir boiling mixtures without risking contact with the skin, as many of these plants were contact toxins. The rhabdos of Circe may have been a tool of her trade, a wand coated in a concentrated resin or sap, a secondary source of the pharmaca that she could apply directly to the skin of the victim. When she struck them, she was not casting a spell, but delivering a transdermal dose of a paralytic agent, ensuring that the oral ingestion of the wine was reinforced by a chemical contact poison. This striking was the final seal of their doom, a medical intervention administered with the swiftness of a sword stroke. The distinction between the magic of the gods and the science of the herbalist is a thin veil, and in the case of Aeaea, that veil is torn away by the text's insistence on the physical act of mixing. The goddess does not snap her fingers or command the air. She grinds, she mixes, and she serves. This labor connects her to the lineage of the pharmacology, the sorceress physicians who practiced their art on the fringes of the civilized world. They were the ones who knew which flower could stop a heart and which root could restart it. The transformation of the men was not a violation of natural law, but an exploitation of it, a demonstration of the terrifying potential of the organic world when manipulated by a hand that knows its secrets. The pharmaca was the true ruler of the island, a liquid sovereign that sat upon the throne of the mind, waiting for the next traveler to drink. The intervention of the divine upon the island of Aeaea manifests not through a thunderbolt or a sudden wind, but through the delivery of a specific botanical specimen, an artifact of nature that carries the weight of salvation. In Odyssey, Book 10, lines 302 through 306, the messenger god Hermes intercepts Odysseus on the forest path, holding in his hand a plant that the text names Moly. This object is described with a botanist's precision, possessing a root that is black in color and a flower that is white as milk, a visual dichotomy that signals its potent duality. The god pulls this plant from the earth and presents it to the Aeaean king, declaring that it will serve as the elixir pharmaca, the antidote to the potions of the goddess. This moment marks the first instance in the written record of the West where a specific herb is identified by its physical properties as a counteragent to a chemical or magical attack, grounding the supernatural conflict in the soil of the island. The mystery of the plant's identity has driven the inquiries of naturalists for millennia, leading back to the botanical compendia of the ancient world. Theophrastus, the father of botany, addresses this very plant in his Enquiry into Plants, specifically in Book 9, Chapter 15, Section 7. He confirms the description found in the Homeric text, noting that the moly has a root that is difficult to dig up because it is round and deep, akin to the onion or the bulbous plants that hide their power beneath the surface. The physicality of the root, dark and buried in the earth, contrasts with the luminous purity of the flower that rises to meet the sun, a structural opposition that suggests a chemical composition capable of neutralizing toxins. The plant is not merely a symbol, it is a tool, a piece of organic technology that the Olympian order provides to counter the pharmaca of the Titan daughter. Modern pharmacological investigation offers a compelling candidate for this ancient antidote, shifting the narrative from the realm of spellcraft to the history of medicine. The snowdrop, specifically the species Galanthus nivalis, presents a morphology that aligns with the white flower and the hidden dark bulb of the moly. More importantly, the snowdrop contains galantamine, a chemical alkaloid that functions as an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. This specific biochemical function is critical in the context of the poisons likely employed by Circe. If the pharmaca she used were derived from the datura or mandragora families, which act as anticholinergic substances that block the neurotransmitters responsible for memory and motor control, then galantamine serves as the direct physiological antagonist. The ingestion of the moly would reverse the paralysis and the delirium, allowing the subject to maintain cognitive function even when the chemical weapon attempts to sever the mind from the body. The presentation of the plant by Hermes elevates the nature of the struggle on Aeaea from a contest of brute strength to a dispute of specialized knowledge. Hermes does not offer to fight the goddess on Odysseus's behalf. He provides the king with the means to resist her on her own terms. The Moly acts as a credential of the Olympian pantheon, a safety pass that allows a mortal to navigate the perilous currents of a titan's domain. When Odysseus enters the hall, clutching the plant in his hand, he is holding a specimen of divine pharmacology, a piece of biological armor that renders him impervious to the chemical assault that enslaved his crew. The plant operates as a physical key that unlocks the trap of the potion, proving that the power of the goddess, while vast, is not absolute and can be countered by the precise application of botanical science. The textual evidence in the Odyssey emphasizes the difficulty with which the plant is obtained, noting that it is dangerous for mortal men to pluck from the earth, but the gods can do all things with ease. This statement reinforces the concept of the Moly as a liminal object, situated between the human capacity for survival and the divine capacity for mastery over nature. The blackness of the root signifies its stonic origin, its connection to the dark, fertile secrets of the underworld, while the white flower signifies its solar and celestial potential. By consuming this plant, Odysseus internalizes both the darkness of the earth and the light of the heavens, fortifying his constitution against the confusion of the wine. The antidote is not a passive shield, but an active agent of clarity that imposes order upon the chaotic chemistry of the potion. This botanical intervention redefines the hierarchy of power within the narrative. Circe, the master of herbs, is defeated not by a sword, but by a superior herb, one that exists outside of her usual stock. The Moly represents a layer of botanical knowledge that she does not possess or cannot access, a strain of power reserved for the messengers of Olympus. The antidote serves as a reminder that for every toxin there exists a countertoxin, and for every spell of forgetting there is a root of remembrance. The king of Ithaca sits in the hall, the white flower perhaps crushed in his fist, or the dark root chewed and swallowed, a living testament to the efficacy of the first antidote in literature, preserving his humanity against the swine-making draught. The silence of the hall is filled with the heavy breathing of the men, pigs in form only, while the man who holds the moly remains untouched by the chemical oblivion that surrounds him. The failure of the potion to obscure the mind of Odysseus precipitates a crisis within the hall of Aeaea that shifts the encounter from a ritual of enchantment to a brutal contest of physical dominance. In Odyssey, Book 10, lines 324-334, the text describes a sudden and terrifying escalation. The goddess, realizing her pharmaca has failed to bind the Ithacan king, raises her wand to strike him, but Odysseus does not retreat. Instead, he draws his xiphos, the short, double-edged sword of the Bronze Age warrior, and rushes at her with the intent to kill. This specific gesture, the unsheathing of the blade, transforms the nature of the interaction, stripping away the veneer of divine mystery to reveal a stark reality of survival. The sword, a weapon forged for the sole purpose of ending life, becomes the central object of the narrative, overshadowing the wand and the loom, and forcing the goddess to confront the primal violence that lurks beneath the surface of heroic hospitality. The weapon Odysseus wields is not a generic artifact of war, but a tool of specific lethality, catalogued in the archaeological record of the late Helladic period. Excavations at the Mycenaean shaft graves, specifically Grave Circle A at Mycenae, unearthed Type G swords, long, slender blades of bronze designed for thrusting rather than slashing, capable of piercing armor and flesh with devastating efficiency. When Odysseus draws this blade, he introduces a physical threat that transcends the magical boundaries of the island. The Odyssey states that Circe, Seeing the naked steel and the murderous intent in the eyes of the king, shrieks and runs, not to her loom or her vessels of potion, but to the far corner of the hall. This reaction is not the composure of an omnipotent deity. It is the panic of a solitary woman facing a larger, stronger opponent who is armed and willing to commit murder. The text provides a critical detail that is often overlooked in retellings. Circe flings herself at the knees of Odysseus, wrapping her arms around them in the universal gesture of supplication known as Aeaea. This physical act, documented on the shield of Achilles in Book 18 of the Odyssey, and depicted on the François vase, a 6th century BCE volute crater currently housed in the Archaeological Museum of Florence, was the only protection afforded to a person facing imminent death. By touching the knees, the suppliant made themselves the property of the victor, pleading for mercy and acknowledging their total defeat. That a daughter of the sun, a titan of ancient lineage, is forced to assume the posture of a slave before a mortal man reveals the terrifying proximity of the violence. She does not summon thunder or call upon her father's fire. She submits to the superiority of the blade. This moment of vulnerability casts a retrospective light upon the earlier transformations of the crew. The scholarly analysis of this scene posits that the threat of violence is not merely a reaction to the sword, but the catalyst for the entire defensive strategy of the island. The text states that Circe fears not just death, but a specific violation, crying out in lines 332 and 333 that he is a man of great courage, and asking if he has come to unman her. The Greek term used carries connotations of stripping away one's pride and power, often through sexual violence or humiliation. In the context of the Bronze Age, where the sack of a city invariably led to the enslavement and assault of the women within, the arrival of a ship full of warriors on a remote island posed an existential threat. The men of Odysseus were not merely hungry travelers. They were armed combatants, seasoned by 10 years of war, entering the home of a woman who lived without a male guardian. The transformation of the sailors into swine can thus be interpreted not as an act of malice, but as a desperate measure of self-preservation. The savage magic of Circe is a direct response to the civilized violence of the Greek warrior. By turning men into pigs, she neutralizes their capacity to wield weapons, to force their will upon her body, and to destroy her sanctuary. The potion acts as a chemical disarmament, stripping the threat before it can materialize into the physical assault that Odysseus later attempts. When the king rushes her with the sword, he validates her fear, proving that without the protection of her baka, she is at the mercy of his strength. The sword of Odysseus, cold and sharp in the dim light of the hall, justifies the existence of the potion. The dynamic between the two figures shifts entirely because of the drawn blade. The negotiations that follow are not between a sorceress and a hero, but between a victim and a victor. In line 339, Circe swears a great oath upon the river Styx, invoking the name of the blessed gods to ensure that Odysseus will not harm her once she has submitted to his embrace. This oath is a binding contract, a legal maneuver necessitated by the threat of the sword. She trades her body and her hospitality for the safety that the blade has denied her. The love that follows is a transaction born of coercion, a settlement reached at the point of a weapon. The loom, the lions, and the potions recede into the background, rendered insignificant by the raw physics of the bronze sword held at her throat. The archaeological evidence of weaponry from this period underscores the lethality of the threat. The bronze swords found in the Dendra panoply, a full suit of Mycenaean armor dated to the 15th century BCE and held in the Archaeological Museum of Nafplion, demonstrate that the warrior class of the era was equipped for close-quarters slaughter. Odysseus represents this class, a killer who has survived the meat grinder of Troy. Circe, living on the edge of the world, stands as the last barrier between the chaos of the monstrous and the order of the Greek war machine. When the war machine breaches her walls, she is forced to abandon her magic and plead for her life. The transformation of the men was a preemptive strike against the sword. The submission of the goddess was the failure of that strike to encompass the leader. The scene concludes with the sword remaining drawn, the threat hovering in the air like a noxious fog, until the oath is sworn. The text emphasizes that Odysseus does not sheathe his weapon until he has received the absolute assurance of his safety and dominance. He becomes the master of the island, not through magic or piety, but through the willingness to use lethal force against a divine woman. The image of Circe, a daughter of the sun, crouched at the feet of a mortal, clutching his knees while he looms over her with a blade of bronze, shatters the illusion of the enchantress as the aggressor. It reveals the hard truth of the myth, that the magic was a shield and the sword was the spear that pierced it, forcing the guardian of the edge to surrender her autonomy to the violence of the civilized world. The physical metamorphosis of the crew, described in Odyssey, Book 10, lines 237 through 2043, functions not as a random act of cruelty, but as a precise surgical exposure of the spirit. The text states that once they consumed the drugged wine, the goddess struck them with her wand, and immediately they sprouted bristles, grunted, and lost their human shape. Yet a critical detail is preserved in the ancient verse. Their minds remained as they were before, human and aware. This retention of consciousness within the porcine form transforms the event from a simple monster-making curse into a complex psychological imprisonment. The pigsty, a physical structure of wood and mud that would have been typical of a Bronze Age estate, becomes a holding pen for consciousnesses that have been exposed as unfit for the human world. The choice of the pig as the vessel for the sailors is a deliberate symbolic act rooted in the Greek perception of the animal. In the Mediterranean world, the pig was a creature of unbridled appetite, an omnivore that consumes filth and food alike without discrimination. Archaeological evidence from the sanctuary of Demeter at Knossos, specifically the pig bones deposited as votive offerings, confirms the animal's association with fertility and the earth, but also with the lack of control. By placing the men into these bodies, Circe was not inventing a new nature for them, but rather stripping away the social constraints that had hidden their true drives. The men, who moments before were intruding upon a solitary woman's home with demands for food and hospitality, were driven by the same base hungers that govern the swine. The exterior form was merely adjusted to align with the interior reality. The philosophical implications of this transformation are extensively analyzed in the moral essays of Plutarch, specifically in the dialogue The Intelligence of Animals found in his Moralia. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, argues that Circe did not truly change the men into beasts, but rather revealed the beast that was already lurking within them. He posits that the wand of the goddess did not create the bristles or the snout. It simply swept away the human mask that civilization had painted over their true faces. The potion was a solvent that dissolved the veneer of culture. According to this interpretation, the transformation was an act of truth-telling, a forced admission that these warriors, fresh from the carnage of Troy, were creatures of violence and consumption masquerading as men. The pigsty served as the mirror they had avoided for 10 years of war. The material culture of the geometric period provides a stark visual parallel to this concept of the inner beast. The Macedonian Hellenistic grave stelae often depict the deceased in idealized human form, but earlier, more primal artifacts suggest a fluid boundary between man and animal. The bronze figurines of boars from the 8th century BCE, such as those found in the sanctuary at Olympia, display a ferocity and solidity that the Greeks admired. Yet the pig of Circe is not this noble creature. It is a domesticated beast of burden and gluttony. The sailors did not become the wild boar of the hunt. They became the rooted swine of the farm. This distinction highlights the degradation of their character. They were not noble savages, but domesticated consumers who had surrendered their autonomy to their appetites, and Circe simply made that surrender visible. The presence of the wolves and lions in the hall adds a second layer to this zoological taxonomy of the soul. In the Odyssey, the text specifies that these predators were docile, fawning like dogs, and did not harm the men. If the transformation of the men into pigs revealed their gluttony, the behavior of the wolves and lions revealed a hierarchy of character. Predatory animals like lions and wolves are often associated with the aristocracy and the warrior elite in Mycenaean iconography, such as the famous lion gate at Mycenae. These beasts, though wild, possess a dignity and a code of strength. In Circe's domain, these wild animals are tamed and civilized, sitting at her feet, while the civilized men are reduced to wallowing swine. The inversion is absolute. The beasts act with the restraint of humans, and the humans act with the gluttony of beasts. The mirror of the soul is not a physical object of polished bronze, such as the mirrors found in the grave circles of Mycenae, but a chemical and biological reflection cast by the potion. The men looked at each other and saw their comrades as pigs, but the horror lay in the realization that they themselves were looking out through pig eyes. They retained the memory of their humanity, their language, and their past, but they lacked the will to overcome their new instincts. This psychological torture was the ultimate judgment of the goddess. She did not kill them, she showed them who they were. The wooden bars of the sty kept them contained, but it was their own nature that truly imprisoned them, proving that without the external structure of law and civilization, they were nothing more than animals driven by hunger. The permanence of the transformation serves as a testament to the accuracy of Circe's assessment. Unlike a curse that might be lifted with an apology, the porcine form was a correct fit for their souls. It required the intervention of a higher power, Odysseus, to restore their human shape, suggesting that redemption from one's base nature is not a solitary endeavor, but requires external intervention. Odysseus, armed with the Moly and the sword, forces the reversal, but the text implies that the pigs were reluctant to return to their human duties. They had found a comfortable existence in the mud, free from the responsibilities of kingship and the trauma of the war. This reluctance confirms the diagnosis of the goddess. The human form had become a burden to them, and the shape of the pig was a release. The stylistic depictions of this scene on ancient pottery reinforce the idea of revelation. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts Kylix, attributed to the Ambrosios painter and dating to approximately 500 BCE, shows Circe fleeing from Odysseus while the men are depicted as partially transformed, half man and half pig. These hybrid figures, visible in the black figure technique, are not monstrosities in the making, but images of men caught in the act of being revealed. The artist captures the moment where the human mask slips and the animal nature surges to the surface. The clay vessel serves as a permanent record of the psychological truth that the goddess of Aeaea extracted from the sailors. The sty itself, a structure of wooden posts and trampled earth, stands as the architectural monument to this truth. It is a place of shame, built not by the goddess, but by the necessity of housing the true nature of her guests. The sailors who had sacked cities and plundered temples ended their voyage rooting for acorns, their swords useless, their ranks dissolved, and their voices reduced to squeals. The transformation was the final verdict on their character, a judgment rendered in flesh and blood, confirming that the beast within the man is often the truest measure of the soul. The narrative arc of the daughter of Helios takes a sharp and sinister turn within the pages of the Metamorphoses by Ovid, a Roman text composed in 8 CE that expands the biography of the goddess beyond the boundaries of the Homeric encounter. In Book 14, lines 1 through 74, the poet documents a sequence of events that predates the arrival of Odysseus, revealing a capacity for malice that is not defensive but born of spurned passion. This specific textual fragment, preserved on the fragile parchment of medieval manuscripts such as the Codex Marcianus, introduces a rival in beauty, a nymph named Scylla. The scene shifts from the rugged isolation of Aeaea to the coastal waters of Italy, where the sea god Glaucus, a morty fisherman transformed into a prophetic deity of the sea, seeks the aid of the sorceress. He approaches her throne not as a victim, but as a petitioner, asking for a potion to make the nymph Scylla return his love. The interaction between the sea god and the sorceress exposes a volatile undercurrent in the character of Circe that the Greek sources had left dormant. Upon hearing the request, Circe does not immediately offer the requested pharmaca, but instead attempts to seduce the god for herself, offering him her own favors and dismissing the object of his affection as unworthy. The text describes her caressing the beard of the sea god, a gesture of intimacy that underscores her desire to possess rather than to serve. The physical object of her rejection is the unrequited glance, a refusal that sparks a transformation in her intent. When Glaucus rejects her advances, citing an unbreakable bond of love for Scylla, the pride of the Titan daughter is wounded in a manner that the sword of Odysseus could never achieve. The violent threat of a man she could withstand, the rejection of a suitor she could not. The vengeance of Circe against Scylla is a calculated act of biological warfare, a perversion of the herbalist's art that demonstrates the terrifying scope of her power. The Metamorphoses details her journey to the coast of Sicily, to a specific pool where the nymph was known to bathe. The location, identified by geographers such as Strabo as the Strait of Messina, serves as the stage for the tragedy. Circe approaches the water with her collection of roots and herbs, the same tools she used to civilize the beasts of Aeaea, but here they are employed for a singularly destructive purpose. She casts the noxious plants into the clear water, reciting incantations that infect the liquid with a dark potency. The water becomes a chemical trap, a weaponized environment lying in wait for the innocent bather. A transformation of Scylla is rendered with a grotesque anatomical precision that highlights the cruelty of the enchantress. As the nymph enters the water, the liquid around her waist begins to churn and solidify. Ovid writes that she feels a weight dragging her down, and looking into the water, she sees not her own thighs, but the gaping jaws of beasts. From her lower body, a ring of ferocious dogs emerges, snapping and barking, attached to her flesh by an unbreakable bond of bone and sinew. This metamorphosis is not a revelation of an inner beast, but an imposition of an external one. Unlike the sailors who became pigs as a reflection of their souls, Scylla becomes a monster through no fault of her own, her body colonized by the jealous rage of another woman. The archaeological record of South Italian pottery, specifically the red figure vases from Apulia dating to the 4th century BCE, often depicts Scylla as a hybrid creature, a maiden with dogs for legs, a visual testament to the enduring power of this mythological trauma. This act of aggression redefines the parameters of the power of Circe, positioning her not merely as a gatekeeper of the wild, but as an active agent of terror. The creation of the monster Scylla adds a layer of complexity to the perception of the goddess. She is capable of inflicting permanent, generational suffering, creating a hazard that would plague sailors for centuries to come. The dogs that gnaw at the waist of Scylla are the physical manifestation of the hunger and possessiveness of Circe, a literal consumption of the rival's autonomy. The sea god Glaucus, witnessing the horror of his beloved's transformation, is forced to retreat, his love turned to horror, proving that the sorceress would rather destroy the object of desire than see it belong to another. The implications of this myth extend to the interpretation of her dominion over the island of Aeaea. If she could turn a rival nymph into a terrifying sea monster over a dispute of love, the transformation of the sailors into swine takes on a darker hue. It suggests that the power she wields is not merely a tool of justice or defense, but an extension of a volatile and imperious will. The metamorphosis serves as a corrective to the sympathetic reading of the goddess as a victim of circumstance. It reveals a being who, when crossed, possesses the capacity to warp the very fabric of nature to suit her emotional needs. The pool in Sicily, now corrupted by her touch, stands as a permanent monument to the dangers of incurring the wrath of the daughter of the sun. The legacy of this transformation echoes through the later strata of the myth, linking the monster Scylla inextricably to the house of Circe. The textual scholarship notes the irony that the very monster Circe created would later become a neighbor to her island, a hazard that Odysseus must navigate on his journey home. The sorceress effectively placed a time bomb in the waters of the Mediterranean, a creature of her own making that would devour the comrades of the man who would later subdue her. This cyclical nature of violence, born from jealousy and ending in the destruction of the innocent, paints the portrait of a goddess whose power is as absolute as it is capricious. The physical reality of the Strait of Messina, with its treacherous currents and jagged rocks, provided a fitting geological anchor for the myth of the monster. Ancient navigators treated the passage with a superstitious dread, attributing the whirlpools and the sharp rocks to the presence of the dog-headed maiden. The physical geography of the location was overridden by the narrative of the spurned sorceress, the rocks becoming the lair of the betrayed nymph. Circe, standing on the cliffs of her distant island, had reached across the sea to reshape the coastline of Italy, proving that her arm was long and her memory was unforgiving. The narrative of Scylla stands as the definitive evidence of the vindictive potential that resides within the character of the goddess. It strips away the comforting notion that her magic is purely medicinal or judicial. In the pools of Sicily, she revealed herself as a force of chaotic creation, willing to maim beauty to preserve her own pride. The image of the nymph, trapped in a body of barking beasts, serves as a stark reminder that the one who holds the wand is not always the one who holds the moral high ground. The reconciliation between the Ithacan king and the mistress of Aeaea marks a profound transformation in the function of the goddess, shifting her role from that of a perilous enchantress to a necessary architect of the hero's survival. Once the oath has been sworn and the sword of Odysseus is sheathed, Circe ascends from her position of supplication and assumes the mantle of the guide, a transition documented in Odyssey, Book 10, lines 488 through 540. She no longer administers potions to deceive, but rather provides the logistical and spiritual intelligence required to navigate the terra incognita that lies beyond her island. The stone hall, previously a site of entrapment, becomes a war room where the maps of the subconscious are laid out, and the goddess stands as the interpreter of the route to the house of Hades. The instructions given by Circe are not vague wanderings, but a precise set of ritual operations designed to breach the wall between the living and the dead. In lines 517 through 529, she dictates the specific topography of the land of the Cimmerians, a place of perpetual mist, and identifies the exact location where the rivers Oceanus and Pyriphlegethon converge. This is not a geographical location in the mortal sense, but a metaphysical coordinate. To confirm the reality of such rites, one must look to the archaeological site of the Necromontion of Aeaea, located on the banks of the Acheron River in Epirus, excavated in the late 1950s. This complex, dating to the 4th century BCE, served as a physical analog to the mythological descent, a place where pilgrims came to consult the shades of the dead, confirming that the roadmap provided by Circe was grounded in the historical religious practices of the Greek world. The core of her instruction centers on the ritual of the pit, the Bauthanos, a trench dug into the earth to serve as a conduit for the spirits. The text specifies that the trench must be a cubit in length and width, a precise measurement that implies a strict engineering of the sacred. Into this void, the hero is instructed to pour libations of honey, milk, wine, and water, a mixture intended to nourish the insubstantial forms of the dead. The libation vessels, specifically the phiali or shallow bowl, are the physical instruments of this communion, objects found in abundance in grave goods across the Hellenic world. Circe does not merely suggest a prayer, she engineers a chemical and hydraulic mechanism to summon the prophet Tiresias, proving that her mastery extends beyond flora to the manipulation of the soul itself. The sacrificial component of the rite requires the slaughter of a black ram and a black ewe, the specific coloration being a prerequisite for tonic rituals where the darkness of the fleece mirrors the darkness of the underworld. The Odyssey describes the orientation of the ritual, with the hero turning his head away toward the river while the sheep are bled into the trench, the gesture of averting the gaze that signifies the danger of confrontation with the divine pollution of death. The bronze knife, the sphagion used to cut the throat of the animal, becomes the key that unlocks the gate of Hades. Circe, possessing the foresight of a Titan, provides these animals, arming Odysseus with the necessary currency to pay for the knowledge he seeks. She understands that the dead do not speak for free. They demand the warm currency of blood. This act of guidance reframes the character of Circe as a psychopomp, a leader of souls, a function typically associated with Hermes, yet here executed with a rigorous authority that supersedes the messenger god. She delineates the perils that await, not just the destination, but the procedure for survival. She warns of the conflicting voices and the need to let no other spirit approach the blood until Tiresias has spoken. This tactical advice demonstrates a comprehensive knowledge of the hierarchy of the afterlife. She is not sending a man to his doom, but tutoring a student in the most dangerous field operation imaginable. The tablets found at the site of the Necromantion, inscribed with questions for the dead, serve as a tangible parallel to the questions Odysseus carries, questions that Circe enables him to ask. The geography she describes places the entrance to the underworld at the furthest edge of the ocean, reinforcing the concept of the hero's journey as a penetration into the deepest recesses of the unknown. The grove of Persephone, with its black poplars and sterile willows, is catalogued with the precision of a naturalist, suggesting that Circe has viewed these vistas herself. The physical reality of the White Rock, or Lucus Petra, mentioned in line 515 as a landmark, anchors the spiritual voyage in a visible marker, a sea mark for the sailor lost in the fog of the afterlife. This specificity dissolves the boundary between the living world and the dead, positing that the underworld is a physical place that can be charted, mapped, and navigated with the right instructions. By providing this roadmap, Circe facilitates the Nekia, the Nekiomantia, or the rite of necromancy, establishing it as a pivotal chapter in the history of the hero. She moves beyond the role of the seductress or the jailer to become the teacher of the ultimate mystery. The hero is stripped of his army, his crew, and his vanity, left alone with a shovel and a knife to face his ancestors. The goddess stands at the origin of this solitude, the one who points the finger toward the darkness and says, "Go." Her knowledge of the route proves that her dominion on Aeaea is not an exile, but a sentry post on the border of life and death. The provisions she provides for the ship, the wind, and the favorable current further cement her control over the elements of the voyage. She does not merely give advice, she launches the vessel. The text implies that she summons the breeze that drives the ship to the land of the Cimmerians. This manipulation of the weather, a power of the Titans, ensures that the hero arrives at the precise coordinates required for the ritual. The oar of the ship, cutting through the dark water, becomes an extension of her will, guiding the hull toward the gray stone and the perpetual mist. The final image of this segment is one of the goddess standing on the shore of Aeaea, watching the ship disappear into the west, not as a conqueror or a victim, but as the keeper of the gate. She has provided the map, the tools, and the animals, effectively handing Odysseus the key to his own history. The trench waits in the dark land, empty and hungry, a void that the hero is now prepared to fill with blood, following the blueprint drawn by the hand of the daughter of the sun. The mist of the Cimmerians closes over the ship, sealing the hero into the destiny that the sorceress has charted for him. The isolation of the island of Aeaea proves to be an illusion when the broader genealogical record is examined, revealing that the mistress of the loom is merely one node in a vast, interconnected network of power that stretches from the edge of the Greek world to the heart of Crete. In the Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes, composed in the 3rd century BCE, the poetic narrative establishes a definitive link between Circe and the land of Colchis, the eastern shore of the Black Sea. This text, specifically Book 4, lines 559 through 591, documents the arrival of Jason and Medea at the island, seeking purification from the murder of Medea's brother, Absyrtus. The reunion of these two women, the aunt and the niece, confirms the existence of a sorceress dynasty, a matrilineal transmission of secret knowledge that operates independently of the Olympian hierarchy. The alien nature of these women, often cited by scholars as a fear of the other in Greek literature, is actually a marker of their heritage, carrying the ancient, tonic wisdom of the East into the Western Mediterranean. The progenitor of this specific lineage is Aeaea, the father of Medea and the brother of Circe, who rules the kingdom of Colchis from a fortress situated near the river Phasis. Archaeological investigations at the site of Vani in modern-day Georgia, identified by many historians as the heart of the ancient Colchian kingdom, have unearthed an abundance of gold artifacts and intricate bronze smithing that corroborate the mythological reputation of the region as a land of immense wealth and advanced technology. The Golden Fleece, the object of Jason's quest, is described in the Argonautica as a physical object of power, guarded by a sleepless dragon, a technological marvel of the East that the primitive Greeks sought to plunder. The women of this bloodline, born of the union between the Titan Helios and the Oceanid Perse, inherit not just the solar radiance, but a specific, technical understanding of the natural world that manifests as pharmaca. The dynasty is further cemented by the figure of Pasiphae, the sister of Circe and Aeaea, who serves as the queen of Crete and the wife of King Minos. In the Bibliotheca of Pseudo-Apollodorus, Pasiphae is credited with a specific magical act that mirrors the talents of her sister when Minos proved unfaithful. She concocted a potion that caused him to ejaculate serpents and scorpions, killing his mistresses. This specific biological manipulation demonstrates that the knowledge of potions and transformation was not unique to Aeaea, but was a shared family asset, a curriculum passed down through the female line. The Palace of Knossos, excavated by Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, revealed a labyrinthine complex where the Lady of the Labyrinth was inscribed on Linear B tablets, KNG 702, a title that hints at the dominion of these women over the intricate and the hidden. Pasiphae's most infamous act, the coupling with the bull of Poseidon to birth the Minotaur, is often framed as a curse, yet it also displays a terrifying mastery over the boundaries of species, a hallmark of the Colchian matriarchy. Medea, the youngest holder of this mantle, arrives on the shores of Aeaea not as a supplicant, but as an equal, carrying her own satchel of botanical secrets. In the Argonautica, Medea is described as a priestess of Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and crossroads, a deity to whom Circe also pays homage. The text states that Circe immediately recognizes the pollution on her niece, the stain of kinslaying, but does not turn her away. The ritual of purification that follows, involving the sacrifice of a suckling pig and the washing of hands, is a formal religious procedure, indicating that these women functioned as high priestesses of a mystery cult that predated the Olympian religion. The clay vessels used to hold the purifying water, a common find in sanctuaries of Demeter and Persephone, serve as the material anchors for this shared liturgy. This interaction proves that the power of Circe is not an anomalous mutation but a preserved tradition, a discipline that can be taught, learned, and inherited. The transmission of this knowledge suggests a matriarchal counterculture within the patriarchal structure of the heroic age. While the men, Jason and Odysseus, rely on physical strength and martial prowess, the women of this dynasty rely on technique, skill, craft, and the manipulation of chemical and biological forces. The pharmaca of Medea, famously used to rejuvenate the elderly Aeson, the father of Jason, shares a functional identity with the potions of Circe, which transform men into beasts. The difference lies in the application, not the essence. The Colchian women possess the keys to life, death, and form, a monopoly on the fundamental forces of biology that renders them indispensable and terrifying to the Greek heroes. The bronze knife used to cut the herbs, the mortar used to grind the roots. These are the industrial tools of their trade, objects of a specialized science that men do not possess. The concept of the alien woman is central to understanding this dynasty. Colchis, situated on the periphery of the known world, was viewed by the Greeks as a place of magic and danger. The women who came from this line, Circe, Pasiphae, Medea, are consistently portrayed as transplants in the Greek world, foreigners who bring their dangerous knowledge with them. This foreignness allows them to operate outside the social contracts that bind Greek women. They are not bound by the laws of the polis. They are sovereign agents of a more ancient order. The shrine of Persephone at Locri Epizephri, a Greek colony in Italy, provides a physical parallel to this power dynamic. The votive tablets found there depict Persephone and Hades, but also scenes of women in positions of religious authority, suggesting that the worship of Chthonic deities was a primary vehicle for female agency in the ancient world. The flight of Medea to Aeaea in the Argonautica also highlights the solidarity of this sisterhood against the violence of men. Jason has manipulated Medea, used her magic to secure the fleece, and then dragged her across the sea as a prize. When they arrive at Circe's island, they are fugitives. Circe's willingness to purify them, an act that puts her at odds with the Erinyes, the avenging spirits of the murdered Absyrtus, demonstrates a fierce loyalty to the bloodline. She shelters her own kind against the consequences of male ambition. The island becomes a sanctuary for the witch, a place where the alien woman can find refuge from a world that seeks to use and discard her. This dynastic perspective fundamentally alters the perception of Circe's actions on the island. Her transformation of men into pigs is not an isolated act of a solitary monster, but a standard defensive protocol of the Colchian matriarchy. Just as Pasiphae defended her conjugal bed with curses and Medea dispatched her enemies with poisoned robes, Circe defends her sovereignty with the swine sty. It is a coherent, consistent policy of power preservation. The knowledge of the pharmaca is the weapon they hold against the sword, the only weapon available to women in a world of warriors. The legacy of this dynasty would echo through the literature of the classical world, transforming these historical women into archetypes of the witch. Yet, the archaeological and textual evidence points to a reality of specialized knowledge, a guild of female technicians who understood the volatile properties of the natural world. The ruins of Colchis, the labyrinth of Crete, and the stone hall of Aeaea stand as the three pillars of this empire of herbs and spells. The transmission of power from aunt to niece ensures that the secret knowledge does not die with the individual, but survives as a continuous thread, weaving through the tapestry of myth as a potent, feminine alternative to the brute force of the heroes. The dynasty of Helios persists, not through the swords of kings, but through the potions of the daughters. The conclusion of the Homeric narrative in the Odyssey leaves the Ithacan king upon the threshold of a fragile peace. Yet the ancient texts of the epic cycle reveal a darker, more definitive epilogue that was seared into the historical record by the poet Eugemon of Cyrene in the 6th century BCE. This lost epic, the Telegony, survives only in the summaries of Proclus and the fragments quoted by later scholiasts, but its content fundamentally reshapes the destiny of the man who survived the Trojan War. The narrative does not end with the slaying of the suitors, but continues with the emergence of a new actor upon the stage of history. Telegonus, the son of Circe and Odysseus, born on the island of Aeaea. This figure, whose name translates to born from afar, represents the physical extension of the goddess's will into the wider world, a living instrument of fate conceived during the year-long sojourn of the king on the enchanted island. The maturation of Telegonus on Aeaea occurs under the direct tutelage of the Titan daughter, a period of incubation where the primal power of the mother is fused with the heroic lineage of the father. The Telegony fragments indicate that upon reaching manhood, the youth set sail in search of his father, driven by a compulsion to know his origin. This voyage mirrors the journeys of the father, yet it carries an inverted purpose. Where Odysseus sought to return home, Telegonus seeks to leave the sanctuary of the island and enter the dangerous arena of the mortal world. The vessel he pilots is not merely a ship, but a carrier of destiny, transporting the latent consequences of the union between the civilizing sorceress and the wandering king across the wine-dark sea. The armament of Telegonus serves as the central material artifact of this historical reconstruction, a weapon that bridges the gap between the monstrous and the martial. Instructed by his mother, who possessed an intimate knowledge of the perils that awaited him, Telegonus forged a spear tipped with the spine of a stingray, a biological weapon of envenomed death. The stingray spine, a serrated fossil of the deep, serves as a potent symbol of the wild, untamable nature of the sea that Circe commands to her lineage. This choice of weaponry is a specific tactical deviation from the bronze swords of the era, reflecting the unique technological perspective of the goddess. She provided her son not with the tools of the city, but with the tools of the wild, a toxin that would bypass the armor of the hero. The arrival of Telegonus on the rocky shores of Ithaca precipitates a catastrophic failure of recognition, a tragic collision of two bloodlines that had been separated by the vastness of the Mediterranean. According to the summary preserved in the Chrystomythy of Proclus, Telegonus, mistaking the island for a hostile territory, began to raid the coastal herds, acting in accordance with the ancient customs of piracy that defined the heroic economy. Odysseus, ever the defender of his domain, marched out to repel the invaders, unaware that he was facing his own progeny. The dust of the conflict rose around them, obscuring the truth until the fatal blow was struck. The stingray-tipped spear, driven by the strong arm of the sun, pierced the flesh of the father, fulfilling the prophecy of Tiresias that Odysseus would find a gentle death coming from the sea, a euphemism that masked the brutal reality of kinslay. The death of Odysseus at the hands of Telegonus acts as the final closure of the cycle of violence that began with the Trojan War. The gentle nature of the death, often debated by commentators, refers not to the pain but to the source. It came not from an enemy of the state, but from the salt water itself, delivered by the grandson of Helios. When the dying king and the victorious youth finally exchanged names, the silence that fell over the battlefield of Ithaca was absolute. The recognition of the patricide shattered the mind of Telegonus, who had sought only a father's embrace and found a father's corpse instead. The body of the king, wrapped in the shroud of his own making, became the cargo for the return voyage to Aeaea, a grim testament to the inescapability of fate. The return to the island with the body of the hero marks the culmination of Circe's long game, a moment where her role shifts from a passive hostess to the arbiter of the afterlife. The Telegony records that she received the body of Odysseus and made him immortal, a final act of preservation that contradicts the mortal necessity of death. This deification confirms that the power of Circe extends beyond the transformation of men into beasts. She can also transform men into gods. The island, once a prison for the mind, becomes a mausoleum for the greatest of the Greek heroes, a sanctuary where the boundary between the living and the dead is permanently dissolved by her will. The aftermath of this tragedy sees a reordering of the dynastic structures of the mythological world, a series of unions that cement the power of the sorceress dynasty. The fragments state that Telegonus married Penelope, the widow of Odysseus, while Telemachus, the son of Penelope, married Circe. This exchange of partners effectively absorbs the house of Ithaca into the orbit of Aeaea. Penelope is brought to the island of the sun, not as a captive, but as a queen, exchanging the loom of Ithaca for the loom of the goddess. The final disposition of the souls, sending Penelope and Telemachus to the Isles of the Blessed, clears the stage of the mortal players, leaving Circe and her son as the sole inheritors of the heroic legacy. This sequence of events validates the necessity of the initial transformation of the crew into pigs. Had the men not been neutralized, had the island not been defended by the strict application of her law, the lineage of Telegonus might never have been secured. The son of destiny was the product of the union forced by the threat of the sword but solidified by the power of the wand. The death of Odysseus was the price of that union, a debt paid in blood to the goddess who provided the roadmap to the underworld and the heir to close the circle. The stingray spine, now stained with the ichor of the hero, stands as the ultimate artifact of the myth, a jagged point where the will of the gods and the mistakes of men intersect. The silence that falls over the island after the burial is heavy with the weight of completed destiny. The loom of Circe continues its rhythmic clatter, weaving the fate of the world from her throne at the edge of the west. The body of the king lies in state, preserved forever in the golden light of her father, a monument to the dangerous allure of the goddess who turns men into pigs and makes gods of kings. The island of Aeaea remains a fixed point in the fluid geography of myth, where the sun stands as the guardian of the father's eternal sleep. The warning delivered by the mistress of Aeaea in Odyssey, Book 12, lines 37 through 54, serves as the connective tissue between the domestic enchantment of the island and the maritime terror that lies beyond, forging a thematic link between the singer of the hall and the singers of the sea. Circe explicitly identifies the sirens, detailing their location and their method, warning Odysseus that to hear their song is to never return home. This advisory role positions her not merely as a gatekeeper, but as a connoisseur of acoustic power, one who recognizes the potency of a song that rivals her own. The voice that led the sailors into the hall with a promise of rest is the sister to the voice that calls from the meadow with a promise of truth, establishing a dichotomy of fatal seductions that the hero must navigate. The sirens, as depicted in the Odyssey, occupy a specific geological niche, a meadow piled high with the rotting bones of their victims. a physical site of accumulation that contrasts sharply with the polished stone floors of Aeaea. In Book 12, lines 45 through 46, the text describes the great heap of bones and the shriveling skins that litter the shoreline, providing a grisly archaeological record of their allure. These creatures, the sirens, offer a commodity that is distinct from the physical pleasure offered by Circe. They promise knowledge, specifically the knowledge of all things that have passed in the world. The hero is tempted not by wine or flesh, but by the vanity of omniscience, a hunger of the mind that proves just as lethal as the hunger of the body. The comparative analysis of these two threats reveals a terrifying symmetry in the dangers faced by the voyager. The Song of Circe, documented in Book 10 as she weaves at her loom, acts as a lure of domesticity and stasis, a promise that the war is over and that peace can be found in the surrender of the will. Conversely, the Song of the Sirens acts as a lure of intellectual conquest, a promise that the chaos of the world can be ordered and understood if one simply stops to listen. Both songs demand the cessation of the journey, the halting of the oar, and the surrender of the nostos, or homecoming. The Sisters of Song, as they are sometimes styled in later Hellenistic poetry, function as a pincer movement of oblivion, trapping the sailor between the desire for comfort and the desire for truth. Like Ophron of Alexandria, in his obscure epic poem The Alexandra, dated to the 3rd century BCE, provides a genealogical fragment that deepens this connection. In lines 712 through 718, he identifies the sirens as the daughters of the muse Terpsichore, or in other traditions, of the river god Aeschylus. Yet they share a common lineage of tonic power with the daughter of Helios. They are the entanglers, a definition that aligns perfectly with the etymology of Circe. While Circe ensnares the mind with pharmaca and the body with transformation, the sirens ensnare the soul with a melody that cannot be unheard. The physical remnants of the sirens' meadow, the white bones mentioned by Homer, serve as a counterpoint to the pigs of Aeaea. One is a graveyard of the physically exhausted, the other a sty of the spiritually emptied. The mechanism of defense against these two threats further delineates their nature. Against Circe, the defense is the Moly, a root of divine origin that hardens the internal chemistry of the hero against external manipulation. Against the sirens, the defense is the wax, a physical barrier that seals the sensory organ, the ear, preventing the input of the fatal data. Odysseus must be armored from the inside to withstand Circe, and armored from the outside to withstand the sirens. This distinction highlights the vector of the attack. The sorceress strikes at the metabolic will, while the monsters strike at the sensory perception. The beeswax, a humble organic substance used for sealing ships and preserving food, becomes the talisman of survival against the high art of the sirens, just as the root was the talisman against the magic of the goddess. The nature of the death offered by each entity provides the final interpretative key to their parallel existence. The sirens offer a death of the body through the starvation of the enraptured listener, a static demise on a sun-bleached shore. Circe offers a death of identity, a continuation of biological life in a form that has been stripped of its human agency. The men in the sty possess their minds, yet they cannot act. The men on the shore lose their lives, but they die with the illusion of supreme knowledge. Circe's death is a living oblivion, a soft, luxurious sinking into the primal nature of the beast, whereas the sirens offer a hard, sterile exit into the silence of history. The text of the Odyssey implicitly acknowledges the superior danger of Circe by the duration of the stay. Odysseus passes the island of the sirens in a single day, the threat neutralized by the wax and the ropes, yet he remains on Aeaea for a full year, seduced by the comfort of the goddess and the ease of her table. This duration suggests that the temptation of the domestic, the allure of a beautiful woman who offers food and rest, is far more difficult to escape than the cold promise of knowledge. The sirens are a hurdle to be cleared. Circe is a quagmire that threatens to swallow the timeline of the return. The visual culture of the archaic period often conflated these figures in the artistic consciousness. The siren vase, a red figure stamnos from Attica, dated to 480 BCE and held in the British Museum, depicts the sirens not as mermaids, but as bird women, hybrid creatures that share the liminal, transformative nature of Circe's lions and wolves. These artistic depictions serve as material proof that the Greeks categorized these threats together as beings who stood at the intersection of the human and the animal, the natural and the supernatural. The silence that follows the passing of the sirens is the silence of survival, but the silence that follows the departure from Aeaea is the silence of a severed bond. Circe, by warning Odysseus of the sirens, acknowledges the fraternity of their power. She recognizes that her song and theirs are the two pillars of the hero's temptation. One leads to the mud of the sty, the other to the dust of the grave. The hero sails between them, ears sealed and mind fortified, escaping the circular trap of the Sisters of Song, leaving behind the bones on the shore and the bristles in the mud. The evolution of the figure of Circe from a revered divinity of the archaic world to a marginalized sorceress of the Roman imagination constitutes a profound shift in the theological and social history of the Mediterranean. In the earliest strata of the Hellenic record, the mistress of Aeaea commands the reverence due to a divinity of the first order, a being whose power is innate and whose status is unquestioned. Homer, in the Odyssey, designates her explicitly as a goddess, a term that places her within the same hierarchy as the Olympians, possessing a household that functions as a temple and a will that cannot be contested by mortal men. This classification is not merely poetic flattery, but a statement of theological fact, recognizing her dominion over the natural and the supernatural as a birthright of her Titan blood. The physical evidence of this divine status survives in the geographical surveys of the ancient world, most notably in the work of Pausanias, the 2nd century CE traveler and geographer. In his Description of Greece, Book 2, Chapter 3, Section 6, Pausanias documents a specific site on the mountain of Circaeum, located on the coast of Italy, which was identified by the locals as the throne of the goddess. He notes that the inhabitants of the region did not merely tell stories of her, but maintained a physical tradition of her presence, pointing to a cup made of stone that she herself had used. This artifact, the Cup of Circe, serves as a material anchor for her divinity, a votive object that bridges the gap between the mythological narrative and the ritual landscape. The existence of such a landmark confirms that for centuries she was a tangible presence in the religious geography of the West, a localized deity who demanded respect rather than the fear reserved for outcasts. As the classical age transitioned into the Hellenistic and subsequently the Roman era, the perception of the daughter of Helios underwent a darkening process, reflecting a broader cultural anxiety regarding independent female power. The poem Aeneid, composed by Virgil in the 1st century BCE, serves as the pivot point for this transformation. In Book 7, lines 10 through 24, the Roman poet describes the environs of Circe's island, not as a place of civilized hospitality ruled by a goddess, but as a nightmarish landscape of perpetual howling. Virgil writes that the island groans with the roaring of lions and the braying of wolves, sounds that populate the darkness with a terror that is absent from the Homeric account. Here, she is no longer a weaver of fate singing at her loom, but a shadowy figure whose presence induces a primal dread, distancing her from the pantheon of revered deities and aligning her with the chaotic forces of the wild. This degradation of status is further cemented by the specific nomenclature applied to her in the Roman texts, where the title of Dea or goddess is gradually supplanted by the term circatrix, a descriptor that emphasizes her trickery and malice over her divinity. The archaeological record of Roman domestic art, particularly the frescoes found in the ruins of Pompeii, such as those in the House of the Centenary, Reggio IX, Insula 8, visually track this decline. In these 1st century CE paintings, Circe is often depicted as a woman of formidable beauty, but her scale is reduced, her iconography stripped of the regal scepter and the solar associations. She is painted holding a small vial or a wand, objects that frame her as a practitioner of the dark arts rather than a sovereign of nature. The wand, once a symbol of authority akin to a royal staff, becomes the tool of a witch, an instrument of forbidden knowledge rather than divine law. The shift from goddess to witch mirrors the societal consolidation of patriarchal structures that viewed autonomous female power as a threat to the order of the state. In the Greek framework, the power of the goddess was a fact of nature, an immutable force that the hero had to navigate, respect, and even submit to. Odysseus does not defeat Circe. He survives her by entering into a pact, acknowledging her status as an equal or superior force. In the Roman narrative, however, the autonomous woman is recast as a deviant, a being whose power is illicit and dangerous. The witch is a figure who exists on the fringes of society, operating outside the jurisdiction of the paterfamilias and the Scythic gods. By stripping Circe of her divinity, the Roman imagination neutralizes her threat, reducing her from a cosmic force to a mere obstacle to be overcome by the virtues of the Roman hero. The textual evidence in Ovid's Metamorphoses further elaborates on this demonization, focusing intently on the mechanics of her magic rather than the authority of her lineage. The detailed descriptions of her gathering herbs, chanting incantations, and poisoning the water depict a laborious, technical process, distinct from the effortless will of a true god. This technique of the witch implies that her power is learned or stolen, a subversion of the natural order rather than an expression of it. The bronze mortar and pestle, tools of the apothecary, replace the golden throne as the primary symbols of her identity. This material shift in the narrative focus serves to disempower the figure, anchoring her to the earth and the messy, fearful reality of folk magic, rather than the clean, distant heights of Olympus. The influence of this transformation extended beyond literature into the realm of historical belief, where the line between the mythological past and the present blurred. Pausanias, in the same passage that mentions the stone cup, recounts a local tradition that the dictator of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, sent his sons to consult the oracle of Circe. This attempted consultation implies that her status had shifted from a deity one worshipped to a prophetic voice one consults, a subtle but critical demotion. She is no longer the recipient of state cults, but a voice of the occult, consulted for specific, often political, ends. The transition reflects a world where the old, wild divinities were being tamed or recast as ghosts, haunting the periphery of a civilized empire. The final stage of this historical trajectory sees the complete erasure of her solar heritage, leaving only the image of the enchantress. The memory of her father Helios fades, replaced by associations with Hecate and the moon, deities of the night and the crossroads. This nocturnal rebranding completes the inversion of her character, the daughter of the sun, who sees all and illuminates the truth of the soul, becomes the sorceress of the night, who blinds and deceives. The lions and wolves, once her noble guardians, become the tormented victims of her lust and cruelty in the Roman retellings, a projection of the fear that powerful women will emasculate the men who cross their path. The degradation of Circe from goddess to witch stands as a testament to the changing tides of Western consciousness, a process of demonization that would define the treatment of powerful women for millennia to come. The stone cup on the mountain of Circaeum remains as a silent witness to reformer glory, a relic of a time when the daughter of the sun was a queen to be feared and honored, before she was reduced to a figure of nursery tales and dark suspicion. The wand is broken, the solar crown is dimmed, and the witch stands alone in the shadows of the Roman grove, a haunting echo of a displaced divinity. The chronological arc of the mistress of Aeaea reaches its terminus, not in the dusty fragments of papyrus or the weathered stones of a ruin, but in the printed pages of the 21st century, where the narrative has been seized and recalibrated by the descendants of the very civilization that once sought to demonize her. The publication of Madeline Miller's novel, Circe, in 2018 stands as a monumental artifact in this reclamation, a text that functions less as a work of fiction and more as a corrective history, translating the silence of the goddess into a roar. This volume, sitting upon the shelves of contemporary libraries, represents the final overturning of the Roman degradation, stripping away the title of witch to restore the status of a divinity who was never a monster, but a survivor. The modern lens treats the events on the island not as a threat to humanity, but as a necessary assertion of boundaries, validating the premise that the transformation of men into pigs was an act of sovereign self-defense. The textual reconstruction begins by addressing the solitude that the ancient texts treated as exile, reframing it as a chosen sanctuary. In the earlier sources, the isolation of Aeaea was a punishment or a strange aberration, but the modern synthesis posits that the island was a fortress built against a world of male violence. The physical object of the loom, previously a symbol of domestic entrapment, is re-examined through the essays of Margaret Atwood, specifically her critical work on the portrayal of female power in myth. Atwood's analysis, found in her collection Second Words, 1982, and various subsequent commentaries on the Odyssey, dissects the fear that the Greeks held for a woman who lived outside the dominion of a father or a husband. The loom becomes the banner of her independence, a tool of creation that she controls absolutely, refusing to weave the patterns dictated by the Olympian patriarchy. The specific incident of the transformation, the core mystery of the swine, is subjected to a rigorous forensic re-evaluation in this modern era. No longer viewed through the superstitious fear of the Dark Ages, the act is now read as a preemptive strike against the predatory intent of the sailors. The Odyssey itself, when stripped of the hero's bias, records that the crew of Odysseus were men who had plundered cities and taken women as spoils of war. When they landed on Aeaea, they entered the hall not as supplicants but as conquerors, expecting to take what they pleased. The potion, the pharmacology, served as a chemical veto to this assumption of access. The modern reclamation posits that the pigs were not victims of a curse, but perpetrators of an attempted violation who were stopped by the only means available to a solitary woman facing a band of armed invaders. The shape of the pig was merely the external manifestation of their own refusal to see her as a person rather than an object. The scholarly recovery of the Daughter of the Sun narrative aligns perfectly with the modern understanding of trauma and agency. In Miller's text, the specific detail of the golden cup from which Circe offers the wine is inverted. It becomes a vessel of truth rather than a trap. The men drink and lose their humanity because they lacked it to begin with, their souls having been corroded by the long war of Troy. This interpretation is supported by the material evidence of the Bronze Age, where the collapse of civilization was often accompanied by the raids of the sea peoples, marauders who destroyed the palatial centers of order. Circe stands as the last bastion against this wave of chaos, her wand a weapon of civilization, holding back the tide of barbarism. The turning of men into animals is the implementation of a law that the world had forgotten, a law that demands respect for the sacred autonomy of the hearth. The reclamation also addresses the fear of the other that drove the Roman demonization of the goddess. The essays of Margaret Atwood frequently highlight how the label of witch has been historically applied to women who possess knowledge that threatens the patriarchal status quo. In the context of Aeaea, the pharmaca represents a specialized knowledge of nature, a science that the male heroes could not conquer with their swords. The modern interpretation views the fear of Circe's magic as a projection of male inadequacy, a terror of a power that cannot be beaten in combat. The island of Aeaea, therefore, is no longer a lair of a villain but a site of learning and resistance, a place where the herbs of the field are used to police the boundary between the rapist and the guardian. The silence of the ancient goddess, the lack of her own written account in the Homeric verses, is filled by the modern voice. The textual gaps in the Odyssey, the moments where Circe acts without explanation, are now sealed with the logic of the oppressed. She did not speak because her voice would not be heard by men who saw her only as a conquest. The modern reclamation gives voice to that silence, asserting that her actions were rational, justified, and necessary. The wand she carries, the rhabdos, is no longer a prop of enchantment but a staff of office, declaring her absolute authority over the territory she holds. The lions and wolves that fawn at her side are not ensnared victims, as the Roman poets claimed, but allies who recognize a protector when they see one, gathered around a sovereign who has tamed the wildness of the world to create a home. This shift in perspective transforms the obstacle of the myth into the goal of the modern reader. Where Odysseus sought to escape, the modern audience seeks to understand. The ruins of the Mycenaean palaces, once the centers of the warrior culture that Circe opposed, now stand as empty shells, testaments to the fragility of empires built on force. The solitary island of the goddess, however, persists in the cultural memory as a symbol of endurance. The danger that the Greeks feared was simply the danger of a woman who refused to be owned. By validating her right to defend her solitude, the modern synthesis closes the book on millennia of misunderstanding, finally acknowledging that the monster was never the woman at the loom, but the men who sought to break the door down. The final image of the series remains fixed upon the figure of Circe, standing on the shores of Aeaea, not as a figure of dread, but as a sentinel of peace. The sea crashes against the rocks, the eternal boundary between the wild water and the sanctuary of the land. She holds the wand loosely in her hand, the tool of her defense, watching the horizon not for victims, but for threats. The transformation of the men into pigs stands as the definitive judgment of history, that when civilization fails to restrain the beast within man, the sorceress must do it herself. The island is quiet, the loom is weaving, and the daughter of the sun stands vindicated in the light of a new understanding.